We're still relatively young. We are evolving, we're maturing. I would not say we're mature yet. And as we know, there's still a significant proportion of the school estate within the UK, within England rather, that sits at maintained school level. Anyway, for the academy sector, we have an overarching piece, the Finance and Assurance Framework, and that comprises various elements reflecting the structure, the legal structure of trusts. So firstly, we're publicly funded organisations. Our money substantially comes from the state. Yes, we get some non-grant income through lettings, school meals and so on, but principally we are publicly funded organisations, and as such we have responsibilities and obligations. We're companies, so each of our trusts are registered as a company, company's house, company's number, we have secretaries and so on, and we're also charities. Now this mess, this structure comes out of the fact that the way that academies were set up initially and subsequently has been embedded through legislation is of those different structures. It means we're complicated, messy. So the framework that we operate under is also a little bit complicated. We have our funding agreements. So when the trust was first established, each of us would have had a funding agreement with the Department for Education, stroke Secretary of State, because it has to be signed by an individual. So that's the structure that we have, a funding agreement. Now that's kind of for life, although as we know, the department have introduced new model funding agreements and nudge us, encourage us, arm twist us to adopt the new ones at any opportunities. And there may be a separate funding agreement or supplemental agreement with our faith provider, depending upon whether we're a diocesan trust or other faith. So within the funding agreement, there's a requirement for us to be compliant with the Academy's financial handbook. And that's the term that's in the funding agreement. A couple of years ago, the Academy financial handbook name changed to Academy Trust Handbook, open brackets, also known as Academy's Financial Handbook, close brackets. So that's the legal way that the DFE have been able to maintain that continuity. And that changes each year. And Hayley and myself sit on a working group that reviews the changes that the department are wanting to put in place, and we push back and challenge as to why these changes are being implemented. And also we are required under our funding agreement to complete submissions, various submissions, one of which is the annual report and accounts. And that's covered by the guidance note, which is the Academy's accounts direction. And that gets updated each year with any new areas that the department feel they want to highlight, bring to our attention, or require additional detail and information on. For this year, there's been a particular focus on health and safety and school estates. The starting point for this, to my understanding, is because of concerns about the poor condition of some school buildings and in turn the associated safety risk. As Rob mentioned at the start, RAC has certainly highlighted that, and I think is going to be quite significant in terms of how this may play out. And for us today, looking at completing our statements, we need to be very clear on what we are doing on RAC, but also what we are doing more widely in terms of other building condition issues. I'm not going to go through the detail of what the additional requirements are because you can see those, but it is around this piece around principal risks and uncertainties, which we already have to include as the statement, but there's an additional emphasis, expectation on trustees to ensure that the trust estate is safe, well maintained and complies with current regulations. Now, bearing in mind this came out in April, RAC at that time was not the focus that it was at that time, so it is a broader piece. A piece around the value for money statement, referencing how we've handled estates safety, and how as regularity, propriety and compliance also includes estates safety and management. I think in terms of an introduction, that gives an overview, Rob, and I would suggest it's best now to move to Hayley, please.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great. And yes, so I think I'll pass you straight over to Hayley, who's can introduce herself, formerly ASCL's business leadership specialist, but I know you're adopting a new role at the moment. So maybe you tell us a little about that, Hayley, and then maybe just follow on from Stephen.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, very happy to. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Hayley Dunn and I work for ASCL. So I was ASCL's business leadership specialist and have been for the past 5 years, but I've just changed roles to become ASCL's Director of Finance and Governance. But as Stephen alluded to, as during my time of being the business leadership specialist, I was ASCL's representative sitting on the Academy's Assurance Steering Group and Working Group 1, which specifically looks at things like the Academy Trust Handbook and good practice guides. But also through the steering group, we also have, as being representatives of ISBL and ASCL alongside other organisations. It's a broad group that sit on those working groups. So you'll have representatives also from organisations like CST, NGA, the diocese. So there's a broad range of stakeholders that are involved in that process, and the Academy Accounts Direction is one of the documents that we get to scrutinise as part of that process. But what does come through from that is that there's a high level of confidentiality. So there's a lot that Stephen and I aren't able to talk about, but I think there are things that we can help by talking about some of the background to this. And I thought what I'd do is to highlight, because obviously you're seeing the output from the ESFA's document in terms of the requirements of what you're being expected to do, but just to give you some of the background of how some of this has come to light. So for example, back in May 2021, the Condition of School Building Survey that the DfE released found that there was a cost allocation would be required of £11.4 billion in order to repair or replace the defective elements across the education estate, with the highest needs relating to electrics, which was estimated at 2.5 billion, and followed by items such as boilers, pipework, external walls, windows and doors and roofs needing an extra 1.5 billion. So way beyond any of the allocations that we're seeing through capital funding. From there, we saw the DfE annual report and accounts in 2021-2022 that included building condition as a significant risk. And the report stated at that time that there's a risk of collapse of one or more blocks in some schools, and that the risk predominantly exists in some of the buildings that were built during the years 1945 to 1970, and that were particularly system build, light frame technique built buildings. And over that period, they said from what they could see, it was unlikely that that risk was going to reduce going forward. So it was likely to remain as a significant risk going forward. And I think we've seen that expedited within the last couple of months. Then if you look at some of the other actors in the system, so for example, the Health and Safety Executive, so the HSE in July 2022 announced that their HSE inspectors would be deployed to assess the management of asbestos in schools, which they did through the autumn 2022 through into March 2023. And these were single focus inspections looking specifically at the management of asbestos, with advance notice across England, Scotland and Wales, because HSE have got that broader scope than just concentrating on English schools. And you can view the improvement notices and the prohibition notices that were issued as part of that programme on the HSE website. It's all publicly available information. But what you will see is that there are instances where inspectors found that risks aren't being actively managed. So there was one prohibition notice for a school with a potential risk of exposure in a boiler room, and there were 27 schools that received improvement notices for management, inadequate or missing information. So some quite significant risks across the school estate. And as I understand it, the HSE, I think based on what they found and the level of non-compliance that they found, they're planning another inspection regime that will be starting this term, which will likely go through to probably March, a similar time sort of next year. So we're likely to see more improvement notices being issued around that if things haven't improved. And I understand that they're going to be using intelligence of potential high risk schools in order to look at that, to decide which schools that they're going to be into. Then if we look at another actor in the system, we've got the National Audit Office. Now, the National Audit Office in January, February 2023 engaged stakeholders to undertake a value for money study on the condition of school buildings. The study examined whether the Department for Education has an effective approach to supporting the maintenance, the repair and the rebuilding of the estate across England. So specifically looking at England in this case, including whether the department has got a good understanding of the condition of school buildings, appropriate arrangements to allocate funding for school buildings in line with need, and assurance that the funding for school buildings is being used both efficiently and effectively. And the conclusions of those reports were published on the 28th of June 2023. So I think once I get into sharing with you some of the conclusions from that report, you'll see where some of this additional responsibility is being levered into the system, because as Stephen said, the Academy Trust Handbook as it stands is the main lever that the ES have for you complying. That's why they are doing this, because of a number of the issues that have come through, the risks that have been identified and some of the reporting that's gone on behind the scenes. So the conclusions from the NAO were quite wide ranges, as you imagine, and they were quite damaging as well in terms of what they were calling for. So they were outlining the responsibility that there was for the DfE to ensure that responsibilities had got the information and the support that they needed. They outlined the underinvestment that there was in the system, which I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you about in terms of the underinvestment of capital funding. And most seriously recognising the significant safety concerns across the estate and how these risks have escalated over time, and that there is a need for improvement in the system, and that they wanted to get across that the DfE needed to ensure that its approach delivered best value from the resources that it currently had available. So all of those things tied together, and lots of other things that are going on in terms of research and the information that's both publicly available and that information that the DfE and the ESFA will be collecting behind the scenes, you can see that there's a number of elements that have contributed to raising the risk and the profile. It's not just what you're seeing in the media and the current issue with RAAC. I mean, RAAC isn't new. I mean, we were talking about RAAC and the risks of that sort of 2 years ago. I think whatever they've seen over the summer in some particular cases where perhaps the surveys have found that there isn't a high risk, but actually it should have been, there's obviously a heightened risk around that at the moment. I think, as Stephen said, as we know that there isn't the funding going into the system, it's likely that this risk isn't going to come down anytime soon, and that we're having to pick up the pieces of that. So in terms of those changes in the Academy Accounts direction, there isn't anything new for you to be doing, but they want to be looking at how you're complying with that. So I think when you're working with your trustees to put your report together, is to perhaps put a summary together of some of the things that you're doing on a regular basis, some of perhaps the survey work that you've had done, particularly to look at high risk areas, whether that's your asbestos management, RAAC management, or particular issues that are specific to the context of your buildings and your infrastructure. That's what you want to be putting across. But it doesn't get away from the fact that responsibility to support responsible bodies sits with the government. But actually what we're being asked to do here, I think, as part of that process for highlighting the risk, is to put some compliance forward. So Rob, I think if I pause there, I'd really like to hear from some of the practitioners of how they're managing this on a day-to-day level.
Yeah, thank you, Hayley. Yeah, superb sort of synopsis of what's going on and some practical examples and background as to why this has come about. Like you say, this is not new duties or obligations, but it's really reinforcing some of the things that about how we're reporting and making sure that we're doing some of the due diligence and process around estates management. And I can come on to some of that towards the end. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to Anita Martin. She is Director of Finance for Greenshaw Learning Trust. They're a trust of, I think, 25 schools clustered around West London right through to the west of England. And she could probably explain a bit better, but also she'll just explain how she's interpreted the new AAD guidance and what specifically what she's doing in terms of maybe some examples of how she's adapted her reporting. Anita, can I hand over to you? And I can't see your video at the moment. I don't know if anyone else is.
If I speak, I'll probably come on screen. Is that
perfect?
What I move to the front? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Stephen and Hayley, for that really helpful introduction to where we find ourselves. What I thought would be helpful for me to do is just to set out a little bit of what we're doing at Greenshaw Learning Trust and how we've approached our trustees report this year, and some of the drafting that we've kind of thought through, having drafted that already, and see some of that might be of use to you. So as Rob said, we're a trust of 25 schools and continuing to grow if all goes according to plan, we'll be 30 schools by the 1st of November. So some significant growth there. So it just puts you in a bit of our context. We're in a very fortunate position to not have any RAC in any of those schools. So my context is going to be sort of, we're not focusing too much on that other than just to identify that we're not affected by that in our report. So I know Mo will bring in some of that. But in terms of those key changes,
can I really quickly interrupt, Anita, because I think we've still not got you on the screen, and I think it's more than just me. Your camera's on, so I wondered if you maybe would try turning your camera off and back on again, and just see if that clicks you in, because I've sort of spotlighted you now for delegates, but it's not quite working. There you are.
You have me
right.
Now.
We've got you. Sorry, really sorry to interrupt, but it's much nicer if we can see you while you're talking.
Absolutely
so
agree.
Back to you.
Absolutely agree, and thank you to you, Rob, for helping us to see other people's faces, because so many times on these webinars you just speak to an empty room. So great to see some faces. So yeah, I was just setting out a bit of context of us as a trust. And so in terms of our trustees report, just going through those key areas of change, some of the things that we've thought about. So just taking the principal risks and uncertainty section, one of the pieces of work that we've been doing as a trust is looking to map out the cost of our life cycle sort of maintenance over the next 10-year period. And like many of you, if you've embarked on that journey, will identify that there is quite a gap between our cost that we've identified over the next 10 years in terms of dealing with all of our kind of high risk and those emerging sort of maintenance and higher category works that need to be done across our estate. There's a gap between that, a significant gap between that and our school condition allocation funding. And I do appreciate that there's probably smaller trusts on the call who don't have access to that, and therefore even more of a position of gap there in terms of being reliant on having to do applications every year, relying on those applications being successful for SIF, and that probably creates even more uncertainty for you. So we have actually identified in our statement, in our trustees report, a little bit of just articulating that gap that we see in terms of that emerging gap and the impact that could have on delaying some of those works that are required across our estate over the next 10 years. And linked to that, really, in that section of our report, we've also articulated the sort of financial impact and the timelines of achieving the government's environmental targets for us on our net zero. And there's a real overlap here in between some of our condition work and modelling that over the next 10 years, and also then modelling the net zero agenda alongside that. So when we look at our condition data, we're going to see that we're likely to replace boilers, kitchen plant and equipment over that next 10-year period. And there's a crossover then with our environmental targets in terms of achieving that. And so looking to see how we can deliver our net zero alongside those condition priorities. And that gap even widens then. And we've tried to do this in a couple of our schools recently. We needed to replace the boilers. And it's heartbreaking when you model the differences there between a gas boiler replacement versus something like a ground source heat pump or whatever. And you model the differences in costs there, and then you submit a bid to the DFE and you're unsuccessful in terms of achieving additional funding to make that environmental choice, because the differences in cost are so significant. And so I think in principal risk and uncertainty is the growing cost of condition, the gap between that and our funding coming through, those of you on SIF even more impacted by that, and then mapping alongside that our desire and ambitions to meet the government's targets, and trying to see how we can overlap all of that together, but actually the gap widens as you try to do all of those things. So that's the kind of stuff that we've started to talk about in our principal risk and uncertainty section. And then coming on to the value for money section, so obviously there is now the AO's responsibilities explicitly put in there, as Stephen has outlined, to include health, safety and management. And some of the work that we've articulated in there is what we've been working on over the last sort of 5 years, really, in terms of some of those wins that we can do that links to sort of our environmental targets, as well as reducing exposure to high energy costs. So some of the work that we've done around installing PV panels in 21 out of our 25 schools, and continuing to work on the remainder of those schools. We've replaced all of our lighting to LED lighting in 21 out of 25 of our schools so far. That has not only deliver some significant environmental impact, and we're seeing some of our usage data now really impacted by some of those choices that we're seeing our usage numbers actually really going down. That's also reducing our exposure to the volatility at the moment in the energy markets, and that high cost there. So if you're not doing that already, then these are some options that you might not be doing this to be able to talk about it in this year's report, but there might be some future gains that you can look to do that. But that's some of the work that we've been doing, and we'll continue to do that as we move forward to make sure all of our schools are kind of in the same kind of position for that. And the other thing that we do around what we've articulated in the report for our value for money statement is around the strategic planning of our investment in our priorities across the trust. So we carry out a condition survey on all of our schools. We are growing trust, and so we have a number of schools join us each year. Every single one of the schools that join us, we carry out a full condition survey for all those schools, part of our due diligence, but also gives us vital information about where those schools are, what those priorities are. And then the crucial thing for us there is how we utilise those reports in terms of setting our priorities for the investment through our school condition allocation, through our investment into devolved formula capital, through our investment in any other funding that we need to invest through reserves, etc., to ensure that we are aligning those funding sources to the priorities that we've identified through those condition reports. So again, if you're not carrying out those reports, and we were in a very good position when we came to the RAC, our Director of Estates had actually reported to our board back in June that none of our schools were impacted by that because we'd carried out all of those reports. We had all that data on file. And it's incredibly helpful when you're setting out those investment priorities and those spending priorities. So that's the kind of stuff we've been putting in our report there. And then obviously there's the regularity statement. I won't bore us on that. There was a further one that I just wanted to stress about in terms of one thing that we've done this year that you might want to think about is in terms of internal controls assurance work. So many times, we focus on the financial aspects of internal controls. This year or last year, really, which we're now putting in our report this year, our internal controls focused on a number of areas that were non-financial, but they were really about internal controls. And one of those key pieces of work that we did was around health and safety, and how the board can seek assurance that the health and safety and all of that compliance is being managed throughout all of our schools, and that's a significant number of schools in our case, how all of that's being governed and managed, and how do we seek assurance, and who holds that assurance, and all of those, is all of that information, is all of that in place. And so we've been able to then bring about some of our findings from that in terms of that. So again, just another bit of a case study there, if that might be something that you might want to consider. And our internal auditors, well, they're external, it's an audit company, they actually did that piece of work for us in terms of health and safety management, compliance, all of that aspect. So when you're shaping your internal controls audit plan for this coming year, that might be something you want to think about in terms of how you can bring health and safety compliance and those sort of things into that framework and get some added value out of that need to do internal controls assurance work. So I think that's the main sort of thing that I wanted to cover, and just to give you some kind of some pointers really as to what we're doing, how we've approached the report. I've not taken it as an onerous addition to the report. There are a couple of bullet point lines in there. I'm not going to put oodles of written work in there. It's just really some signposting to give some assurance that the trustees can take, that the accounting officer, when they're signing it off as well, they can take that actually we've actually addressed those items that have been highlighted for this year. So that's all I was going to say, if that's okay, Rob, unless there's any questions, which we're going to probably take at the end.
Yeah, thanks, Anita. That's fantastic. Really helpful, some really practical stuff, and sort of going through those lines that are in the AAD and just sort of showing how those focus on, like you say, you're doing this stuff already, and a lot of it's just reporting, but it is quite a nice reminder because, having worked with Greenshaw for a while as well, we understand some of your processes and that you're doing a lot of this in the right way, and we'll talk a little bit about GEMS in a moment. So for you, it's very much reporting on on some best practice stuff that you're working on, but also potentially a bit of a reminder, especially for maybe some of the smaller trusts who haven't got so much experience and resource about some of the things that we need to be thinking about. Before we move, well, I'd like to move on to Mo really now, if that's okay. So Mo Chatra, recently with another trust, you might want to introduce yourself in that way, Mo, but I know you're Deputy CEO now of Academy Transformation Trust, so a new role there, but got experience on a slightly more finance focused role previously as well. So we're going to hand over to Mo, and I will try and highlight you for everyone as well. So and we can see you loud and clear. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hi everyone, I'm Mo Chatra, Deputy CEO of Finance and Operations at Academy Transformation Trust. Very recently joined ATT, having previously worked at a fairly large regionally speaking trust within the East Midlands called Lionheart Educational Trust. Was there for 4 years and happened to spend 7 years at the DfE working on the Priority School Building Programme. So when the matter of estates is concerned, I had first-hand experience of that area, and also saw firsthand how unfortunately we were, despite our best efforts, able to fund only part of the condition need of the schools estate across the country since the Priority School Building came in, and obviously was replaced by the School Rebuilding Programme more recently. So starting with principal risks and uncertainties, so as you pointed out earlier on, Rob, ATT is experiencing the RAAC issue. We have it present at one of our schools. We were notified by the DfE 1 working day before the start of term, sorry, 2 working days before the start of term, that we were not to open the main block at the primary school in Clacton-on-Sea in Essex. So as you can imagine, a lot of work then had to occur over a weekend, and in order to ensure that we were able to plan effectively with very, very little notice. The survey itself was carried out only a couple of days prior to receiving that letter. So it all happened very, very late, and we had very little time to prepare. And on top of that, we had some mixed messages, it's fair to say, from the DfE itself around what support we were and weren't going to receive. So one of those was we were to cover revenue costs ourselves, but then that position has since changed. And I think, well, I say it has changed, I think it has changed on a case-by-case basis. So again, it does not help the fact that there is a little bit of ambiguity there. So in going back to the trustees' report then, it becomes challenging because trustees are being asked to provide those assurances over a matter which to an extent are beyond their control and beyond the control of the trust. I think all they can commit to within the trustees' report is statements to the effect of, you know, we are able to, we will endeavour to make best use of the funds that we have available. Though we are in receipt of SCA, they frankly will not go anywhere near far enough to address the full condition needs of our estate. And I think given the change in emphasis within the accounts direction, we will have to make that clear. At the same time, we do acknowledge that the DfE is trying its best, and you know, it is up against, you know, competing interests from other departments who are also, you know, seeking additional funds from Treasury. Now, in terms of the value for money statement, I'm going back to my former trust. At my former trust, Lionheart, we had implemented several large value projects. We had healthy finances and were able to address condition need through new build projects. And we had 3 on the go last year. And so if I were still at my former trust, I'd be writing about the approach we took to those around using frameworks in order to deliver value for money. And also value engineering as well, because this was all happening at a time when the cost of construction was going up on a almost daily basis. So Again, we can explain what we did to work with the framework operator and also the construction companies themselves in order to ensure value for money. On top of that, another example that at my former trust we implemented last year was signing up to something called Energy Sparks. Energy Sparks is a national benchmarking initiative which allows you to compare energy usage compared to other schools around the country. And a number of trusts already signed up to that. And we were able through that to identify savings in the region of £60,000 last year. So things like that, again, lend itself well to the value for money statement. But coming back to my current trust, just linking back to governance in conclusion, one of the areas I've identified that we need to perhaps be a bit more stronger on is linking decision making at trustees level to investment decisions around the estate, and especially linking that to health and safety. So clearly identifying how condition reports feed into recommendations made to trustees and how they are then informed of that in order to make decisions around where our SCA and DFC is invested. So articulating that within the relevant sections of the financial statements, I think is something that we'll look to focus on for the 22-23 accounts.
Mo, thanks very much. That's fantastic, and again, really helpful. Practical examples and a slightly different perspective, obviously, to Anita, where you've got some RAC there. You've moved trust recently. Slightly different on the energy, but it's really interesting to hear you both bring that up as something on the value for money strand, which is really important. And we've done a lot of work in the sector about trying to promote the opportunities for your sustainability journey and move towards net zero, not just the costs but the opportunities for saving, and as Anita said, for insulating yourselves from the volatility of the energy market by potentially generating some of your own and reducing the consumption of your organisation. So that's really helpful. I think really in summary, in terms of the AAD changes or highlights that we've put in, they're really focused around some of the core elements of good estates management for schools. Hopefully you're all familiar with the DfE guidance on that matter, but if you're not, then I strongly encourage you to have a review of that. Good estates management for schools guidance issued by the DfE, and a really good piece of work and structured in such a way that it's very accessible for people at all sorts of levels within the organisation, from the strategic leaders through to some very practical, detailed information for site staff and all your sort of estates managers in between. And obviously, depending on the size of your organisation, you'll be sort of structured very differently. But just to highlight some of those points, very much risk and risk management is absolutely critical. And I think that clear, one of the things that we speak about a lot in terms of risk management, and Anita highlighted the kind of assurance part of that. It's not just managing it, but it's how do you know the assurance piece? How can you prove that what's going on the ground in your individual schools is being reported back, and you've got that accurate picture that you can report at trustee level? So that assurance piece is really hinged on this, the scheme of delegation that you have. And we talk about this sort of golden thread that's running through your organisation as making sure that you've got this very clear lines of communication and scheme of delegation as to how you're actually organising responsibility and accountability within your trust. And we're working with lots of different sized organisations and ones that do it very differently. And I think it's fair to say there isn't a right or wrong way of doing it. It's about deciding what works for you based on your model, whether you are a kind of central controlling type of arrangement where you've got a lot of central resource and you like to control things from the trust, or whether you like to devolve that very much to local school levels. And we've seen it work effectively in both areas, but what's critical across both ways of doing it and everything in between is to have that schedule deal of delegation and clear matrix of roles and responsibilities, so that everyone knows what they're meant to be doing and who is ultimately being responsible for those, particularly those statutory duties which come into that kind of compliance and governance and assurance piece that Anita and Mo have both mentioned. The other thing that we can talk about is the data piece, and Anita spoke about the strategic approach to deploying capital, and one of the things that we really strongly promote is using our condition data effectively to make sure that your capital is deployed where it's needed most, rather than where it's where the noise is being spent where it's needed rather than just wanted, and having a very strategic approach. And again, this is very much tied into the Good Estates Management guidance. So that idea of having condition surveys, but not just having them, but actually having access to be able to interpret and analyze that data in a meaningful way that enables you to then both drive your capital program in a structured way, but also report on that spending in an organized way for your accounts and for your trustee board reports is critical. So at Barker, we've got a solution called EO Portal, which I know a number of trusts on the call use, and that is the way in which we use to aggregate the condition data for trusts with portfolios of schools, to enable you to cut and carve that data and to identify peaks and troughs over a planning period, and hopefully either address those or smooth your spend in and align your capital program with your SCA and other capital funding that's available. So that's a way that we're helping implement the GEMS guidance. And the final thing I'd just like to highlight is on GEMS itself, is this idea of a GEMS audit. If you look on the GEMS guidance, there is a self-assessment tool which the DFE have put together and is reasonably comprehensive. I think there are a few gaps, particularly around the energy and sustainability piece, which I think they are working on, but it's there's always a bit of a lag with kind of DFE guidance to actually get things from what's happening on the ground to kind of fully approved guidance. But in general, the GEMS self-assessment checklist is a good place to start in terms of giving you that overview of, are you looking at and have you got the right systems and processes in across all the key areas of estates management. And all of these things are going to reflect back on your returns and your reports, because they're reflecting on strategic estates management, on governance, on compliance, on value for money and procurement, on energy and sustainability. So all the things that have been mentioned today are picked up in that. One of the things we can do and work with a lot of trusts is working through that report with them and turning that from a kind of self-assessment into an action plan and an estate strategy and plan going forwards. And fundamentally, if you're doing those things, then as Anita and Mo have sort of alluded to, actually articulating that in terms of your reports is a relatively straightforward thing to do. So I think that's everything that we wanted to say today. We're really happy to take any questions. Obviously, we've still got I think Hayley and certainly Stephen, Anita and Mo on the call. If anyone's got any questions, either would like to put their hand up and be brave enough to speak, or to put anything in the chat box, we're pleased to do that. Or as we said at the beginning, we weren't going to concentrate on RAC as a major issue, but we're conscious that that's very much a big topic and on a lot of people's minds at the moment. If there's anything around RAC in particular, we can try and answer some questions on that as well. Obviously at Barker, we've done, I think we're close to approaching 500 RAC surveys now for clients up and down the country. Lots of experience on what that looks like, what mitigations might be, and working with organisations on managing that risk as well. So we'll start to open up to the floor if there are any questions, and if not, I'll just finish off with highlighting another session which we're actually doing this afternoon. So are there any questions? Anyone like to raise their hands or anything that would like some more meat on the bones? I can see that someone's asked Anita what the name of their company was doing their assurance work, which is very kindly highlighted. Matt's put some comments in the chat about pillars of risk, which I think is completely right, and a good structure for this. And Darren's just put a note in about how comfortable are we saying that we have no RAC based on the visual inspections that the DfE have asked us to complete. So I can probably partially answer that, and as I say, I'll also signpost a session that's being done this afternoon in collaboration with we're hosting that in collaborate. Well, sorry, Stone King are hosting it, and we're supporting them on that. And we're going to go into much more depth on RAC. So if you have got some specific detailed questions on RAC, I'll put the link to that in the chat actually. Just in case anyone has got time and would like to join, the link to that is a free webinar that's happening, I think, at 2:30 this afternoon. In terms of reporting on that, when you say DfE have asked us to complete, so there's a few strands to that. DfE have asked for visual inspections. There are some limits to that, and I think the challenge is particularly around those isolated outlier kind of areas where you perhaps can't carry out a visual inspection. So where you might have a difficulty in accessing the structure might be because it's behind a ceiling or a panel, or because there is asbestos in situ that's preventing you from seeing that structure, or because it's maybe a sports hall with a roof that you just can't access because of height without getting specialist access equipment in, those sorts of things. So the likelihood is that the majority of RAC can be identified relatively quickly. It's also fair to say that the majority of instances can be triaged out based on age and construction type, but it's not a completely clear. Obviously, any buildings built sort of after kind of late 90s or certainly 2000, you should be confident are free of RAC. But even taking the window of 1950s to 1990s, there are potential exceptions to that. For example, a Victorian school that maybe had a major refurbishment and in the 50s, 60s, 70s that could have included it. So it's not a completely clear. But we need to just be really careful, particularly on the fact that most RAC is concealed in some way. It's very unusual for RAC to be exposed, because it's a bare concrete element, and most people cover it up because it's ugly. So it will be behind ceilings and behind panels and boards. So the most important thing is to make sure that you're referencing your asbestos management plans and not accessing any of that and without having the appropriate skilled and experienced personnel to do that, and making sure that you've got the right kind of asbestos surveys, because actually the potential risks for asbestos are probably greater than those of RAC in real terms. So it's difficult to answer completely binary. The other point on inspections is CDC surveys. Some people are asking if CDC, the condition data collection surveys that the DfE themselves did, are suitable or a basis on which to make judgments, and the answer is probably no at the moment. Certainly CDC 1 did not pick it up, and it was only midway through the CDC 2 program that there was a ceiling collapse in Kent, and it's after that that the DfE instructed the surveying organisations to add RAC into that program. But we don't think, and we're in constant sort of dialogue with them at the moment via our partners at CST and ASCL and ISBL about this. They probably haven't done the full intrusive surveys that are required to give you 100% compliance. So, sorry, a bit of a long-winded answer, but if you'd like to go a bit deeper on RAC, as I say, if you can make the session with Stone King and some of my colleagues this afternoon, they'll be able to go into that in more depth. Any other questions on AAD or on any of the other examples or queries on how you're going to approach this, or any other observations from those of you that have maybe looked at this, like Mo and Anita, and think there's anything else that you can add for colleagues? Otherwise, we'll sure think about wrapping up.
If nobody's got any comments, or let me just give an extra point whilst people can be thinking about a question or comment. I think for me, there's three potential areas to think about, either for inclusion within your annual report, or for thinking about within your systems. So the first area would be around risk management, reviewing the risk register, making sure that you've got the detail included relating to building condition, related to health and safety, maybe incorporating some of those areas that Anita talked about in terms of the internal audit piece, so a risk piece. Then think about the staff expertise. You can talk about what your current capability is, whether there are any gaps and how you're going to address that, whether it be through bringing in external parties or whether you've got training development. And then the third area would be governance. How well are your governors at local school level and trustees at trust level engaged, involved, embedded within your building condition, health and safety and risk management processes? Now, you may well have that already, in which case take from your systems and include it in your annual accounts return report. Or if there are improvements that you can make, again, you can talk with any of these areas and say, this is where we're at today, but in 2023, we have plans to do X, Y, and Z. So you can spin the positive from this. Mindful of the financial piece. Yes, it needs to be emphasised. Yes, it needs to be pushed. But my counsel would be, don't use it as a whinging opportunity. We have to be spinning the positives within our annual accounts return, but it is a tricky balance. And I think whenever you have the opportunity to input to funding conversations, whether it's through the Regional Schools Commissioner, through ESFA communications, we have to continue to push the funding piece. And for sure, ASCL, NAHT, ISBL and other sector organisations continue to push the issue around insufficiency of capital funding particularly. Thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Stephen. That's great. No, excellent points. Okay, well, I don't think there's anything else in the chat. If any colleagues would like to discuss anything specifically, or would rather not do it in such an open forum, then please do get in touch. I'll put some contact details up at the end, and by all means via our website and our contact us page, happy to pick those up. And if it means directing to others of our speakers, then I'm obviously very happy to do so. Hopefully you've seen the link there to this afternoon's webinar, and so on that basis, I think we'll close off today's session. Thank you very much for attending, and if you have any questions on any of the items raised, whether it's RAC, whether it's the AAD, whether it's some of the GEMS stuff that we've spoken about in terms of implementing that self-assessment checklist and turning that into a strategy, or how we're using data, or some of the energy and sustainability programs that Anita's mentioned, very happy to pick that up with anyone following today. So thank you all. Thank you very much to our speakers, of course, for taking the time out today. I know everyone's flat out as usual, and then RAC gets laid on top of it. But thank you again for attending, and have a good rest of the day.